wrote a piece in 1966 which changed your life probably in some ways, because it was a piece that first, I imagine for many in the public, brought you to the responsibility of intellectuals. A profoundly important piece in which you said it's the responsibility of intellectuals to speak the truth and expose lies. Intellectuals are in a position to expose the lies of governments, to analyze actions according to their causes and motives and often hidden intentions. In the Western world, at least, they have the power that comes from political liberty, from access to information, and freedom of expression. For a privileged minority, Western democracy provides the leisure, the facilities, and the training to seek the truth lying hidden beneath the veil of distortion and misrepresentation, ideology, and class interests through which the events of current history are presented to us. And it seemed to me that epitomizes what has been your role as a public intellectual. Is that your guiding principle?
Whether it's been the role or not is for you to decide, but it's certainly been the guiding principle, something that ought to be done.
And yet at the same time, yeah. I should say we're entering the part of the program where there's going to be a lot more applause, so we'll get used to it. You have, at the same time, pointed out, at the same time as talking about what the responsibility of an intellectual is, spent a great deal of time essentially castigating intellectuals, pointing out that the role of intellectuals has not been that. The role of intellectuals in our society, which I guess I first learned when I was in your class, which surprised me, is really been to be completely complicit in the lies and distortions, and in fact provide an underlying fabric and story on which those people can then use to discuss that. So.
It's unfortunate, but as a fact, I think that's a well-documented fact. Remember, intellectuals are the people who write history, so they come out looking pretty good. But you've got to take, as usual, you have to challenge things that look sort of obvious. If you think about the history of intellectuals, I think you can show that it's quite different. Actually, the term intellectual came into use in its modern sense pretty much with the Dreyfus trial in France, late 19th century. Now, today we admire and respect the Dreyfusards, Emile Zola, others who stood up for justice and so on. You look back at the time, they were a persecuted minority. The great intellectuals, the immortals of the French Academy, bitterly condemned and denounced them. How dare you challenge the august character of the state? You, a writer with no competence, how can you claim that our army is deceiving us, and so on? And in fact, Emile Zola had to flee from France. And that's pretty typical. Take almost any society you like, and you find that there's a fringe of critical dissidents, and they're usually subjected to one or another form of punishment. Depends on the nature of the society. So if it was in Eastern Europe in the last 50 years, they could be jailed, say, like Václav Havel was sent to jail. If it was in our domains in Central America, they'd have their heads blown off. We don't like to think of that comparison, but it's in fact true. The torture, murder, atrocities in our own domain, say Latin America, was much worse than what was going on in Eastern Europe in the post-Stalin era. But in both cases, there's a harsh repression of people who are critical of established power. And that goes back as far as you like. It goes back to classical Greece. So who drank the hemlock in classical Greece? It was the person who was corrupting the youth of Athens by asking hard questions that you're not supposed to ask, Socrates. Take a look at the biblical record at roughly the same period. It's a kind of oral history, but what's reconstructed from it. There were people who, by our standards, could be called intellectuals, people who condemned, criticized the king and his crimes, who gave geopolitical analysis, and they warning that the acts of the kings were going to lead to disaster, who called for mercy, compassion for widows and orphans, and so on. Now, those are people who are called, the translation is prophets. It's a kind of a bad translation of an obscure Hebrew word. But in our terms, they were functioning roughly the way dissident intellectuals do. How were they treated? They were imprisoned, driven into the desert, and marginalized. There were intellectuals who were respected, flatterers at the court. Centuries later, they were called false prophets, but not at the time. And I think if you think through history, that pattern is replicated very consistently.
Let me give a quote of yours that I want you to comment. I have two quotes in that regard I want to comment on before we actually get to some of the specifics, which I want to get to. You point out that no one would be disturbed by an analysis of the political behavior of Russians, French, or Tanzanians, questioning their motives and interpreting their actions in terms of long-range interest, perhaps well concealed behind official rhetoric. But it's an article of faith that American motives are pure and not subject to analysis. Although it is nothing new in American intellectual history, or for that matter, in the general history of imperialist apologia, this innocence becomes increasingly distasteful as the power it serves grows more dominant in the world affairs and more capable, therefore, of the unconstrained viciousness that the mass media present to us each day.
I think that's a defensible statement.
Well, I hope so. You said it, but I think the point, and I remember this vividly.
And remember that this statement is the conclusion from extensive documentation.
And substantiated. And I have many pages that I've been turning over because we don't have time to read your substantiations. But I do remember you making the statement to me many, many years ago, something that seemed obvious. And that, I guess, if you asked a 5-year-old, I think is the way you put it, they'd give you the answer, but you never hear, which is, would you expect that this country would behave differently than any other country, and would you expect that foreign policy wouldn't be carried out in the interests of those who are most powerful in that country, instead of in terms of altruism? But we grow up with this illusion. I didn't grow up in the United States, but it was the same in Canada. The illusion that somehow this country was somehow morally superior to all others.
Yeah, it's called American exceptionalism. There are a couple of problems with that concept. That concept is held by every great power.
Yeah.
So there's British exceptionalism, French exceptionalism, and so on. Secondly, the exceptionalism is wrong. They're all the same.
They're all the same. Now, in fact, there's some great things I'm going to skip, but I want you to also comment on this quote, because this is also in regard to your view towards certain types of intellectual activity. In short, the experts on values, spokesmen for the great religions and philosophical systems, will provide fundamental insights on moral perspectives, and the experts on social theory will provide general empirically validated propositions and general, quote-unquote, general models of conflict. From this interplay, new policies will emerge, presumably from application of the canons of the scientific method. The only debatable issue, it seems to me, is whether it's more ridiculous to turn to experts in social theory for general, well-confirmed propositions, or to the specialists in the great religions and philosophical systems for insights into fundamental human values.
I think, again, that's defensible.
So what do we do?
What we do is recognize that people like us, I suspect virtually all of us, are a privileged minority. Mm-hmm. We do have unusual freedom by comparative standards. There's plenty you can criticize about the country, but by comparative standards, it's very free. The ability of the state to repress and constrain is quite limited for anybody who has a degree of privilege. Now, it's not true if you happen to be a black kid in the slums, but for people like us, people who've gone through college, who are relatively well off, have the resources, have the time, have the access to the internet, have plenty of opportunities, I think that yields conclusions about what we ought to be doing. I mean, quite generally, privilege confers opportunity, and opportunity confers responsibility. And responsibility means dedication to challenging, questioning the verities that are imposed on us by doctrinal systems and structural arrangements that are based on hierarchy and domination, and working, not only challenging them, but doing something about it. And to the degree that you have privilege, there's more that you can do. I think that's just as simple as that.